Chapter 1. The Call from the Wedding Planner. My name is Madison Cole, 35, owner of the Aurora Grand Hotel in Seattle. For years, I worked day and night to build this place, a dream I once shared with my brother, Ethan. When he got engaged, I wanted him to have the perfect start, so I gave them everything: my venue, my staff, my savings, $80,000 of love and pride. But the call came on a rainy morning. The wedding planner said I was no longer invited, and my own brother stayed silent. That was the moment I realized betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes, it comes from the people you die to protect. The phone rang just as I was finishing the morning meeting at the Aurora Grand. It was raining outside, one of those gray Seattle mornings when the light never quite wakes up. My assistant handed me the phone and mouthed the name Victoria Hayes. I recognized it immediately. She was the wedding planner for my brother Ethan's big day in Los Angeles. I smiled out of habit and answered. Her voice came through crisp and detached. "Madison, I have an update from the Hayes family." My stomach tightened. She continued, speaking as if she were reading a weather report. "The bride's family has decided to cancel your invitation." I waited for the rest, for the explanation, for a joke. Then she added, "They will be keeping the $80,000 deposit as planned." I didn't say anything. I heard the faint sound of rain against the glass, the hum of the lobby below, the way my heart started beating hard in my throat. "I'm sorry," she said after a pause, clearly uncomfortable. "I tried to argue on your behalf, but Mrs. Hayes was firm." I forced out a breath. "Did my brother agree to this?" There was another pause. "He did," she said softly. I thanked her, not trusting my voice to say anything more. I hung up and stared at the black screen of my phone until my reflection blurred. $80,000. That was the amount I had personally paid as a gift to Ethan, to help with the wedding expenses, and to let them use my Seattle team for catering. It wasn't just money, it was a gesture, a way of saying, "I believe in you. I believe in the woman you chose." I sat down slowly, feeling the leather chair beneath me grow colder. Across the lobby, guests were checking in, bellmen wheeling luggage, the sound of espresso machines from the cafe. The hotel I built with my own hands, every inch of marble and glass earned through sleepless years, now felt like a stranger's house. My assistant Chloe peeked in. "Everything all right, Miss Cole?" I opened my mouth to say yes, but stopped. I nodded instead. She lingered, sensing something. But I smiled, the kind of smile that ends a conversation. When she left, the room felt heavy with silence. I tried calling Ethan. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I listened to his recorded voice, cheerful and warm, before it beeped. I didn't know what I could possibly say. For a few minutes, I just sat there, replaying every memory that led to this moment. The childhood years when he stood in front of me, protecting me from the fights between our parents. The times he'd fix my old car when I couldn't afford a mechanic. The way he used to tell me, "We're a team, Maddie, always." Somewhere between those words and now, something had cracked. The rain outside grew louder. I walked to the window and watched the water slide down the glass in thin silver lines. A reflection caught my eye, the gold lettering of Aurora Grand Hotel, reversed but still shining. My name was tied to that sign. My reputation, my dignity. I thought of Charlotte Hayes, the woman Ethan was marrying, the way she smiled with that polished, camera-ready confidence, the faintest flicker of disdain behind her perfect posture. I remembered her mother, Eleanor, a woman who shook my hand once and then wiped her fingers on her napkin. They came from a world where money was old, not earned, where service people were invisible. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from anger but from disbelief. They had uninvited me from my own family's wedding and decided to keep my money as if I were some anonymous sponsor. The phone buzzed again. A text from Victoria. I understand this is uncomfortable, but please don't contact the family directly. They want to keep things civil. The word made me laugh under my breath. I slipped the phone into my pocket and left the office. The lobby lights shimmered off the marble floor. Every face that turned toward me was polite, unaware that their boss had just been humiliated in the cruelest way possible. Outside, the rain hit harder. I walked out into it without an umbrella. The air smelled of wet concrete and coffee from the cafe across the street. I crossed the small courtyard and stood under the awning, watching cars crawl through the traffic. $80,000. I said it out loud this time, testing the sound of it. I wasn't angry about the money. I could make that back in a week if I wanted. It was the principle. The audacity, the quiet cruelty of erasing me from an event I helped make possible. I remembered the last conversation Ethan and I had 2 weeks earlier. He had sounded nervous. He said Charlotte's family was feeling overwhelmed, that maybe it would be simpler if I just attended as a guest instead of the host. I told him, "Whatever makes you happy, Ethan." I meant it then, but now I could hear what he had really meant. They don't want you there. You don't belong in their world. A gust of wind swept through, pushing rain under the awning. My hair stuck to my face. I looked up at the gray sky and closed my eyes. For a long moment, I let myself feel it, all the betrayal, the disbelief, the sting of pride. Then something inside me shifted, small but sharp. I wasn't going to beg for inclusion. I wasn't going to call, or text, or plead. I walked back inside, dripping onto the tile. The concierge looked up in surprise, but I just gave her a nod. I went straight to my office, opened the drawer, and pulled out the thick folder labeled Wedding Contract, Hayes, Cole. I flipped through the pages slowly, tracing the legal print with my finger until I found the clause Ava had once pointed out when we first drafted it. Professional conduct. Both parties agree to act in good faith and uphold the reputation of Aurora Grand and its affiliates. Violation will result in forfeiture of services without refund. I smiled for the first time that morning. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from happiness. It was the quiet, deliberate smile of someone who knows exactly where the next move will be made. I closed the folder, set it aside, and looked out the window again. The rain was easing, lightening into a mist. Across the glass, my reflection met my eyes. Steady now. No one has the right to take my dignity. I whispered it once, not as a declaration, but as a promise to myself. Then I picked up the phone. Not to call Ethan. Not yet, but to call Ava. We needed to talk. Chapter 2. The Past and the Family. Bond Ava picked up on the first ring, her voice alert as always. She must have heard something in my tone, because she skipped the pleasantries and asked what happened. I told her about the call from Victoria, every word, every pause, the way she had said keeping the $80,000 deposit like it was a line item in a spreadsheet. Ava stayed quiet until I finished. Then she said softly, "Madison, you're not going to let them get away with that, are you?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew this wasn't over. After we hung up, I sat in the stillness of my office and let my mind drift back to where it had all started, long before hotels and contracts and humiliating phone calls. It was 2010, the year everything in our family fell apart. I was 20, Ethan 22. Our parents' marriage had been crumbling for years, but that summer it finally collapsed under the weight of their silence. Dad moved out first, leaving behind boxes of old tax returns and a set of golf clubs he never came back for. Mom stayed in the house a few months longer, then sold it and left for Oregon, chasing some promise of peace she never found. Ethan and I were suddenly on our own. We rented a small apartment on the edge of Seattle, a drafty second-floor walk-up that smelled like old paint and rain. He worked construction. I waited tables while finishing business classes at night. We shared takeout dinners on the couch and talked about the future like it was something we could design if we just worked hard enough. He was my anchor in those years. When I broke down after a failed exam or another bill we couldn't pay, he'd grin and say, "We're Cole kids. We bounce back." He was protective, sometimes to a fault, but it made me feel safe. I was the dreamer, always sketching logos, scribbling ideas for the cafe I wanted to open someday. He used to call me the hurricane because I never sat still. Then life started to open up. I got a small business loan, then another, and over the years that cafe grew into the Aurora Grand brand. Ethan stayed in construction, climbing up to site manager, then project coordinator. We both worked hard, both proud in our own ways. So when he called 3 years ago and told me he'd met someone, I was genuinely happy for him. Charlotte Hayes, he said her name like it sparkled. She worked in interior design, loved art museums, and Napa weekends, came from a family that owned a line of luxury dealerships in California. When I met her for the first time, I wanted to like her. She was beautiful in the polished way that makes you aware of every wrinkle and hair out of place on your own face. Her voice was soft but carried weight. During dinner at a restaurant overlooking Lake Union, she smiled across the table and asked about my work. "You run hotels, right?" she said. "That must be such hands-on work." Her eyes flicked to my nails, short and unpainted. I smiled back, though the words had landed with a sting I didn't quite understand yet. I told her I enjoyed it, that building something from scratch was fulfilling. She tilted her head and said she admired women who could handle the physical side of business. I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or not. Ethan noticed the silence and jumped in to change the subject. He started telling her the story of how I used to wait tables 12 hours a day to pay for classes. She laughed politely, the kind of laugh that said she was being gracious, not amused. Later that night, when we were alone in the parking lot, I said, "She's different." Ethan gave me a look. "Maddie, don't start. She's just nervous around family stuff." I said I wasn't judging, but he was already shaking his head, half smiling. "You're reading too much into everything again." That phrase stayed with me for a long time. Too sensitive, reading too much. Maybe I was. Months passed, and their relationship moved fast. He took her to meet Dad in Arizona, then to see Mom in Portland. By the time they announced the engagement, Charlotte had already begun helping him pick out suits and practice his posture for photos. He seemed happy, lighter. I wanted to believe it was love. When they came to Seattle to talk about the wedding, we met at the hotel. Charlotte was impressed, or at least she pretended to be. She ran her fingers along the marble reception desk, asked about the chandeliers, the catering service. Her tone was warm enough that I started to relax. She said it would be a dream to have the reception there, and that's when the idea came to me. "You don't have to worry about that," I told them. "Consider it my wedding gift. The venue, the catering, everything." Ethan blinked. "Maddie, that's too much." "It's not," I said. "It's family. You helped me when I was building this place, remember? It's only right I get to give something back." Charlotte smiled that practice smile again. "That's incredibly generous. You really don't mind?" "Not at all," I said, and I meant it. I wanted to see my brother happy. I wanted him to know I still believed in us, in our family, in what we used to be. That night, I called Mom. She was thrilled. "I always knew you'd be the one to keep this family together," she said. Dad sent a short text the next morning, something about being proud of me. It felt like maybe we were all moving towards something better. The first few months of planning went smoothly. My team handled the logistics. Charlotte sent over her color palettes and Pinterest boards. It was professional and polite, but little moments kept catching in my chest. The way she'd say things like, "Let's make sure the staff looks more upscale," or "I'd rather not have too much local flavor on the menu," Once, when I stopped by their tasting session, she said with a light laugh, "Ethan told me you used to serve people at weddings, and now you're hosting them. That's quite the journey." I laughed along, but later, driving home, the words replayed in my head until they burned. Still, I brushed it off. She was young, raised in a different world. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded, and Ethan looked at her like she hung the moon. I told myself that was enough reason to stay quiet. When the final contract was signed, I remember sitting in my office, holding the folder with both our signatures, and feeling something like pride. It was more than a business deal. It was a symbol of trust, a bridge between two families. I had no idea that bridge would soon be the first thing to collapse. The rain returned that evening, tapping against my window in slow rhythm. I stood there for a long time, staring at the city lights through the mist, trying to remember the last time Ethan and I had talked without someone else in the room. It must have been months, maybe longer. He used to call me every Sunday, then every other week, then it became texts, short ones, busy, talk soon. Love you. I kept telling myself he was just caught up in life, but deep down, I felt the distance growing like a quiet tide, one I couldn't stop no matter how hard I tried. I poured a glass of wine, sat down on the couch, and opened an old photo album. There was one picture of us as kids, standing on the pier, wind whipping through our hair, Ethan's arm around my shoulder. I touched the edge of the photo and whispered to the empty room, "Where did we lose it, you and me?" Outside, the rain blurred the city into streaks of gold and gray. Somewhere in Los Angeles, Ethan was probably asleep beside Charlotte, dreaming of the perfect wedding I was helping to build. I didn't know it then, but that gift would soon become the weapon they'd use to cut me out of their world completely. Chapter 3. Cracks under the surface. The changes began quietly, the way cracks appear in glass before the shatter. At first, Charlotte's requests were small. She wanted the lighting softer, the flowers whiter, the menus printed in gold foil instead of cream. Each message came through her assistant, never directly. I agreed to everything. It was their day, after all, and I told myself these were normal adjustments. Then she asked to redesign the ballroom. She sent her own decorator, a woman from Los Angeles, who insisted the existing chandeliers looked dated. I met her one afternoon as she supervised a team removing the floral centerpieces my staff had arranged for another event. She barely looked at me when I introduced myself. "Charlotte wants the room to feel less local," she said, waving a hand in a slow circle. "Something with more pedigree." Pedigree. The word stayed in my head for hours. The next day, my catering manager, Paula, came into my office looking uneasy. She said Charlotte had dismissed two of our senior staff after a tasting. Apparently, she didn't like how they addressed her and claimed the service felt too casual. One of those employees, Maggie, had been with me since the very first Aurora opening. I called Charlotte immediately. She answered on the second ring, her tone bright and cold at once. "Madison, I hope you're not upset," she said. "It's just that your team didn't quite match the standard I'm envisioning. I'm happy to send you a new list of hires from LA who understand high-end clientele." I told her politely that Aurora had hosted senators, celebrities, and CEOs without complaint. She laughed softly and said, "I'm sure they were very impressed. But this wedding is going to be something else entirely." When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment staring at the phone, my hands trembling, though I wasn't sure if it was from anger or disappointment. A week later, I walked into a design meeting expecting to review progress on the ballroom layout. The room was full of people I didn't recognize, her team, her florist, her lighting specialist. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through his phone. Charlotte was explaining her vision to the group, a tone of command slipping through every sentence. When she saw me, she smiled in that professional way that never reached her eyes. "Madison, you made it," she said. We were just going over some final design changes. Final? I asked, setting my folder on the table. I thought we were still reviewing options. She looked at me as if I'd interrupted a performance. Well, I assumed we were aligned. We've decided to replace the carpeting. The pattern feels too corporate. That carpeting had been custom designed, imported from Italy during the first renovation. I kept my voice steady and asked who approved the expense. She turned to Ethan. He hesitated, then said quietly, "It's fine, Maddie. We'll cover it." Charlotte smiled again. See? No harm done. The room was silent. I felt the weight of every eye on me, waiting to see if I'd make a scene. I didn't. I nodded, gathered my folder, and said, "As long as the costs are cleared, do whatever you like." As I walked out, I heard Charlotte's voice behind me, light but sharp. Some people should know their place. Laughter followed. I kept walking. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the balcony of my apartment overlooking the city. The sky was the color of steel. I thought about calling Ethan again, but I already knew how it would go. He'd say I was reading too much into things. He'd say Charlotte didn't mean it that way. He always said that. I took a slow sip and let the burn settle in my chest. For the first time, I wondered if the sister he used to protect was now the woman he was willing to sacrifice for approval. While all this was happening in Seattle, Ethan was sinking into a different kind of silence in Los Angeles. He'd taken a job at Hayes Automotive, working under Charlotte's father. It was supposed to be a step forward for him, a bridge into her family's business. But from what little he told me, it wasn't going smoothly. He mentioned a colleague named Brent, a man in his 40s who always found ways to remind Ethan of his background, a blue-collar boy in a tailored suit. Brent liked to joke during meetings. Ethan laughed it off, but I could tell it got to him. When we spoke on the phone, his tone was tight, the cheerfulness forced. "It's fine, Maddie. Every job has politics." But it wasn't fine. I could hear the frustration he wouldn't admit. He had spent years building himself up with hard work, and now he was surrounded by people who looked down on him for exactly that. At the next family dinner I attended in Los Angeles, the tension was thick. The Hayes mansion gleamed in marble and glass, a world away from our old apartment. Eleanor greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Charlotte floated down the staircase, every movement rehearsed. Ethan looked tired, thinner than before. During dinner, Eleanor asked about my business. "So, you run hotels, correct? How entrepreneurial?" I nodded and thanked her, explaining that we had recently opened a location in Portland. She glanced towards Charlotte. "How lovely," she said. "I do hope it continues to grow. These boutique ventures can be so fragile." Ethan shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Charlotte placed her hand on his and smiled sweetly at me. She said, "Mom just means it's brave of you to stay so involved. Most owners delegate the manual parts." Manual parts. I looked at her perfectly manicured hand resting on Ethan's sleeve and felt something inside me cool completely. Later, when Ethan walked me to my car, I said, "She doesn't respect what we do, Ethan. None of them do." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "She's just under pressure. You know how families like that are. Families like that." The words sounded strange, coming from his mouth. Back in Seattle, wedding plans escalated. Charlotte's decorator replaced our linens with imported silk. She dismissed the hotel's florist and brought in one from Beverly Hills. Every week, another message from her assistant landed in my inbox. Every week, I approved it without protest. One afternoon, Paula came to me looking angry. She said Charlotte had complained again, this time about the scent of the lobby candles. Apparently, she told a guest that Aurora smelled too much like service class. I asked Paula to repeat it. She did, eyes flashing. I thanked her and told her I'd handle it. That evening, I stood alone in the ballroom, breathing in the faint trace of jasmine from those candles. Service class. I had built every inch of this place from the ground up. I had scrubbed floors, carried trays, balanced invoices. If that made me service class, then I was proud of it. Still, something in me broke that night. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was grief. Grief for the brother who couldn't see what was happening, for the girl I used to be, who still believed kindness could bridge every difference. Across the country, Ethan was learning his own lessons. He called one night, his voice low and weary. "Do you ever feel like people see you and already decide what you're worth?" he asked. "All the time," I said. He exhaled into the phone, a long, tired sound. I thought moving up meant finally being respected. Turns out it just means different people find new ways to remind you where you came from. I didn't say anything, just listened. For the first time, he didn't defend them. He didn't defend her. That was the moment I knew the world he had chosen wasn't as solid as he believed, and that sooner or later, the cracks spreading through it would reach him too. Chapter 4. Public Humiliation. It started early on a Wednesday. I was at the hotel, reviewing invoices for the upcoming quarter, when my phone began to vibrate across the desk. Ava's name flashed on the screen. Her voice, usually calm and measured, came through fast and tight. "Madison, have you seen it yet? Pacific Living just published something." I frowned. "Seen what?" She hesitated. The headline reads, "Hotel owner uninvited from her brother's wedding at her own venue." For a second, I couldn't even process the words. I opened my laptop, typed the magazine's name, and there it was, my name in bold, attached to a story I hadn't written, telling a version of my life that wasn't mine. The article quoted anonymous sources close to the family, saying that tensions had arisen between the bride's relatives and the hotel owner. It painted me as the jealous sister, desperate for attention. There was even a photo of me standing outside Aurora, rain-soaked, taken without my consent. Within an hour, my phone began exploding. Emails, texts, missed calls. The PR manager sent a warning. Social media was spinning out of control. By noon, the story had been picked up by gossip blogs, and trending hashtags were calling me bitter, spoiled, controlling. I tried to keep breathing normally, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ava called again. "We're doing damage control," she said, "but whoever planted this story knows exactly what they're doing." I closed my office blinds to block the view of the city. The rain had started again, tapping the glass like it always did when Seattle decided to weep for you. I said quietly, "It has to be them." Ava didn't argue. Later that day, she sent me a forwarded email chain she'd obtained through a contact at the magazine. The sender was Eleanor Hayes. The subject line read, "Regarding upcoming feature." Attached were drafts, revisions, even notes suggesting how to emphasize the family drama angle. My stomach dropped as I read through each message. Eleanor hadn't just allowed it, she'd orchestrated it. I forwarded the emails to myself and sat still for a long time. Outside, the lobby buzzed with guests, unaware that their calm, composed hotel owner was being dissected by strangers online. That evening, my mother called. Her voice was trembling. "Honey, tell me this isn't true." I told her not to believe everything she read, but she had already seen the photos. She said Ethan hadn't returned her calls. By nightfall, even some of my business partners were calling to check in. One of them, a man I'd known for 10 years, said gently, "Maybe issue a statement. Clarify your side." But I didn't want to. I knew that anything I said would feed the fire, so I stayed quiet. 2 days later, Eleanor issued her own public comment through a family spokesperson, calling the story unfortunate but hinting that I had always been difficult to work with. The words created the illusion of grace while stabbing clean through my reputation. At the hotel, staff tried to act normal. Paula avoided meeting my eyes. Maggie brought me extra coffee without asking. I pretended everything was fine, but inside I was calculating what this meant for Aurora. Our brand was built on discretion, reputation, trust. A single scandal could shake that foundation. Ava came over that evening, a laptop in her bag, and a look that told me she'd been awake all night. She dropped her coat on the couch and opened her screen. "We have something," she said. She pulled up the contract file for the Hayes wedding, the one we had both reviewed months ago. She scrolled down, highlighting a section halfway through. Professional Conduct Clause. She tapped the screen. "Here, read this carefully." The clause stated that both parties agreed to act in good faith and protect the reputation of Aurora Grand and its affiliates. Any breach, including defamation or public disparagement, would void the agreement. I looked at her, realization slowly settling in. "You're saying we can cancel the event?" "I'm saying they already did," she replied. "By doing this, by leaking that story, they voided their own contract." I leaned back, exhaling for the first time in hours. She continued, "We'll need proof that Eleanor sent those emails, but I already have a journalist confirming it privately. Once we compile everything, you'll have full legal right to terminate their booking." I nodded slowly, my thoughts beginning to align. The next morning, the media storm only intensified. A popular influencer made a video mocking me for being too sensitive, repeating Eleanor's favorite word. The comments section filled with strangers debating my character, my business, even my worth. But while the world argued, I stayed quiet. Inside the Aurora boardroom, Ava spread the documents across the long glass table. We went line by line, building the case. Each email, each timestamp, each signed confirmation from Eleanor's assistant. She was thorough, methodical, relentless. At one point, she looked up from her screen and said, "You could take them to court, you know. This isn't just breach of contract, it's defamation." I shook my head. "Not yet. They'll destroy themselves soon enough." She studied me, then smiled faintly. By evening, I released a single internal statement to my staff, instructing them not to engage with any online comments or inquiries about the story. "Aurora remains a place of professionalism and respect," I wrote. "The rest, I'll handle personally." When everyone had gone home, I walked through the quiet hotel lobby. The chandeliers glowed softly above, reflecting on the polished marble floor. I ran my hand along the railing of the grand staircase, remembering the nights Ethan and I had talked here, dreaming about the future. He still hadn't called. At home, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, scrolling through the endless feed of speculation. Every post, every photo, every careless opinion. My name had become a headline. I should have felt broken, but what I felt instead was something colder, sharper, controlled. Ava texted me around midnight. "Just finished the documentation. You have full grounds to terminate." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Then let's do it." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city lights shimmered in puddles across the street, reflections twisting like glass. They thought they had humiliated me, but they had just given me the only thing I needed. Leverage. Chapter 5. The Intelligent Counterstrike. The meeting was held in a private suite at the Aurora Grand, though I insisted it wasn't my choice of venue. Ava wanted it neutral ground, but the Hayes family refused to step into any space they didn't control. Ironically, they agreed only after realizing the hotel was already booked under their own event name. The irony wasn't lost on me. The conference table stretched between us like a trench. On one side sat Eleanor Hayes, rigid in a pale suit, Charlotte beside her in a shade of beige that matched her expression. Richard Hayes occupied the far end, silent, eyes scanning the room with detached observation. Ethan sat closest to me, restless, his hand gripping the arm of his chair. Ava sat at my left, files arranged neatly before her, like weapons she intended to use only when necessary. Eleanor started the way people do when they believe the outcome is already decided. "We are deeply disappointed," she said, her voice dripping with controlled irritation. "This display has gone far enough. You've damaged my daughter's reputation, and we intend to hold you accountable." I folded my hands on the table, my tone even. "Your family published private details about me and my business. That's the damage, Mrs. Hayes." Charlotte leaned forward. "You're jealous, Madison. You've been jealous since the day we got engaged." Ava raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I met Charlotte's gaze and spoke quietly. "I'm enforcing a signed agreement, not emotions." Eleanor let out a brittle laugh. "You think hiding behind paperwork makes you righteous? You've humiliated us publicly. You've cost us contracts. My husband's board is asking questions because of your little stunt." I glanced at Richard. He didn't look angry, just tired, maybe curious. He hadn't spoken a single word since the meeting began. Eleanor continued, her voice rising. "If you proceed with this so-called termination, we will sue, and you will lose." I nodded once toward Ava. She reached into her folder and slid a stack of printed emails across the table. "These," she said calmly, "are copies of messages sent from your address to the editor of Pacific Living, along with recordings provided by your own wedding planner, confirming explicit instructions to release those materials." Charlotte's head snapped toward Victoria, who sat in the corner, pale and uncomfortable. "You recorded me?" she hissed. Victoria's voice trembled but stayed steady enough. "I was told to say things that could hurt someone's career. I didn't want to be part of that." Eleanor went completely still. Her eyes cut toward Richard, but he didn't look at her. Ava pushed another document forward. "The professional conduct clause," she said. "You signed this. It clearly states that any party who damages Aurora Grand's reputation forfeits all services and payments rendered." Charlotte laughed nervously. "You're bluffing." I leaned back, calm. "You can have your lawyers verify it. I assure you, they'll reach the same conclusion." For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. Eleanor's hand tightened around her pearl bracelet until it snapped, scattering beads across the table. Ethan finally spoke. "Mom, stop." His voice cracked just slightly, but it was the first real sound of defiance I'd ever heard from him in front of them. She turned on him sharply. "Don't you dare take her side, after everything she's done, after everything you've done." He interrupted, his tone low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You leaked that story. You embarrassed her. You embarrassed all of us." Charlotte reached for his arm, but he pulled back. I watched him, remembering all the years he had stood between me and the world. The way he used to say, "We were a team." It hit me that this was the first time I'd seen him remember that. Eleanor stood, collecting the broken pearls into her palm. "You think you've won something today," she said. "But this isn't over." Ava spoke up, her tone almost polite. "It is. Legally speaking." Eleanor froze, then gathered her purse. Charlotte followed, her heels clicking hard against the marble floor. At the door, she turned back toward me, her eyes glinting. "You think this makes you powerful? You're still nothing compared to us." I smiled faintly. "Then it shouldn't bother you that much." The door closed behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, almost cleansing. Richard remained seated for a long moment. Finally, he looked up at me. "My wife can be impulsive. I apologize on behalf of the family." I nodded. "I appreciate that." He turned to Ethan. "You might want to consider who you're marrying, son." Ethan didn't respond. When they left, the room seemed to breathe again. Ava began collecting her papers, her movements crisp. "You handled that perfectly," she said quietly. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was something colder, something like balance being restored. Ethan stayed behind. When the others were gone, he leaned against the table, rubbing the back of his neck. "You really had all that?" he asked softly. I nodded. "It wasn't about winning, Ethan. It was about truth." He looked down, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't know what they were planning." "I believe you," I said. "But someday, you'll have to decide which side of that table you belong on." He didn't answer. He just nodded once and left. When the room was empty again, I sat there, staring at the polished surface of the table. The reflection of the overhead lights shimmered like water. This wasn't revenge. It was a reminder. Kindness isn't weakness, it's restraint, and for the first time since it all began, I felt the balance start to shift back in my favor. Chapter 6. The wedding collapses. After that meeting, the wedding plans unraveled faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, Charlotte's team withdrew from Aurora Grande completely. They moved the entire event to a luxury hotel in Beverly Hills, one known for its celebrity clientele and inflated prices. Their PR team framed it as a strategic relocation due to scheduling conflicts. Ava sent me the press release, and I couldn't help but smile at the way they tried to rewrite history in public. The truth didn't need defending. It always waited patiently to surface. I stayed in Seattle. The hotel felt strangely quiet after weeks of tension. My staff, who had tiptoed around me since the scandal, began to relax again. Guests came and went. The rhythm of the business returned. But every time my phone buzzed with an update from Los Angeles, I felt a faint pull, as if a part of me was still tethered to that storm. Ethan didn't call. I didn't expect him to. Still, I caught myself checking messages more often than I wanted to admit. On the night before the wedding, Ava came by with takeout and 2 bottles of wine. She tried to talk about anything else, but we both ended up circling back to the same topic. She finally sighed and said, "He's not blind, Madison. He's just scared of what happens when he opens his eyes." Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window and stared at the lights across the bay. I wondered if Ethan was looking at his reflection too, questioning what he had become. In Los Angeles, according to what I heard later, the rehearsal dinner had been a disaster. Charlotte was furious about the guest list being shortened after several sponsors pulled out. She accused her planner of mishandling media optics. Even Eleanor, usually poised, snapped at staff in front of everyone. Ethan tried to keep the peace, as he always did, but the calm he forced onto his face had started to look more like exhaustion than patience. After midnight, he walked out to the terrace for air. The city below was restless with headlights and noise. Inside, he could still hear Charlotte's laughter through the open doors, sharp and bright, followed by the sound of clinking glasses. Then came the voice of one of her friends, amused and slightly slurred from champagne. "You really pulled it off, Char. You've got him locked in." Charlotte's reply was low but clear enough to carry. "I just need his last name to fit in. After that, he can do whatever he wants." The words hit him like an open-handed slap. He froze, hand tightening around the railing. For a long moment, he didn't move. The conversation drifted on without noticing him, dissolving into laughter and gossip. But something inside him had finally cracked. The next morning, Los Angeles woke to sunshine and the kind of artificial calm that comes before a spectacle. Cameras were already positioned outside the hotel. Guests arrived in black cars, stylists rushed in and out, florists adjusted centerpieces worth more than a year's salary. Everything was perfect on the surface, just like Charlotte wanted. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, the groom everyone expected him to be. Perfect suit, perfect tie, perfect silence. Richard knocked once before entering. He studied his son in the mirror. "You look like a man about to climb a mountain," he said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Feels more like a cliff." Richard didn't press. He just nodded, adjusted his cufflinks, and said, "Whatever you do, make sure it's something you can live with afterward." Then he left. Meanwhile, in Seattle, I made coffee and turned on the television. A morning show had a live segment about the most anticipated wedding of the season. I muted the sound, watching images flash of the hotel, the guests, the glittering decorations. There was my brother, walking down the aisle, smiling without warmth. I could read the tension in his shoulders, even from hundreds of miles away. When the ceremony began, I switched off the TV. I didn't want to see it happen. I walked to the window instead, holding my coffee, trying to imagine the vows being exchanged, the cheers, the applause, trying to imagine what it felt like to lose someone you'd already lost long ago. Down in Los Angeles, the officiant cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the floral archway. "We are gathered here today to join Ethan Cole and Charlotte Hayes in holy matrimony." Ethan looked at Charlotte. Her smile was practiced, the kind that photographs well but means nothing. The officiant continued, talking about love, patience, and unity. His words sounded distant, muffled by the pounding of Ethan's heart. When the moment came for vows, Charlotte went first. Her speech was polished, emotional, rehearsed. She spoke of destiny, of loyalty, of a future they would build together. The crowd sighed in approval. Then it was Ethan's turn. He opened his mouth, but the words refused to come. The officiant prompted gently, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then another. The guests began shifting in their seats, the air thick with unease. Ethan lifted his head slowly. His voice was steady but quiet at first. "I can't." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officiant blinked, confused. Ethan took a breath and spoke louder this time. "I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't." Charlotte's face drained of color. "What are you doing?" she hissed under her breath. He turned toward her, eyes clear for the first time in months. "I can't marry someone who sees me as a ticket, not a partner." The officiant tried to intervene, but it was too late. Gasps echoed through the hall, followed by the sound of camera shutters clicking. Eleanor stood up from the front row, her hand clutching her chest. Someone shouted for water. Ethan stepped back from the altar, unbuttoned his jacket, and walked straight down the aisle while reporters shouted questions. By the time Charlotte's scream tore through the ballroom, he was already outside. Back in Seattle, my phone buzzed non-stop. Texts, news alerts, breaking headlines. I sat on the couch, remote in hand, staring at the muted television. The live coverage had shifted from glamour to chaos. I saw the image of Ethan leaving the hotel, his tie undone, Charlotte sobbing into her mother's arms. The anchor's voice was drowned out by noise, but I didn't need to hear it. I understood. For a long time, I just sat there, the city moving quietly beyond the window. Then I exhaled, a small sound between relief and sorrow. Finally, he sees it. I turned off the screen, set the remote aside, and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't triumph I felt, not really. Just the soft ache of truth arriving too late for celebration, but right on time for peace. Chapter 7. Karma and the Fall. Within weeks, the headlines changed again. At first, the media focused on the canceled wedding, the photos of Charlotte crying, the speculation about what had happened. Then a new story surfaced, one no publicist could control. A backstage video leaked onto the internet, filmed by a makeup artist during the chaos of that day. In the clip, Charlotte screamed at her mother, her voice raw with rage. "You ruined everything. You and your stupid pride. I told you not to go after her." The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere on gossip channels, news feeds, even late-night shows. Commentators dissected every frame, analyzing body language and tone. The once perfect Hayes family was now a spectacle. Ava called me early one morning, half amused, half shocked. "You didn't even have to lift a finger," she said. "Karma's doing all the work." I didn't laugh. There was no satisfaction in watching people unravel, even those who had caused me pain, but I did feel something close to quiet validation, the kind that doesn't shout or gloat. It just settles into your bones, like truth finally taking its rightful place. Within a week, Charlotte lost two major design contracts. One client publicly cited ethical concerns, another quietly withdrew their funding. Fashion magazines that once called her the new face of West Coast luxury now ran headlines about scandal, ego, and betrayal. Eleanor fared no better. The Beverly Hills Charity League dropped her name from its annual gala committee. Her friends stopped returning calls, donors distanced themselves, photos of her at luncheons disappeared from society pages. Then came the financial blow. Hayes Automotive, her husband's company, was hit with a tax investigation. A whistleblower came forward about false expense reporting. The story dominated business news for days. The empire that once looked untouchable was cracking in plain view. I watched all of it from Seattle, sitting at my desk between meetings, scrolling through the headlines in silence. It wasn't revenge, it was gravity, every action finding its way back to its source. Ethan returned to Seattle quietly. I didn't know until he called from the airport. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" We met at a small cafe near the harbor, the same place we used to go as kids when we couldn't afford restaurants. He looked older, thinner, the easy confidence gone from his face. When he saw me, he tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. He sat down and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him carefully. "For what, exactly?" "For forgetting who stood by me," he said, "for choosing appearances over loyalty, for not seeing what you were trying to protect me from." The words hung there between us, heavy and real. I stirred my coffee, then said quietly, "I don't need an apology, Ethan. I just need you to live by your own values. That's enough." He nodded, eyes wet, though he blinked fast to hide it. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "Start small," I told him. "Build something honest." He smiled faintly. "You sound like Mom." I smiled back. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. We talked for another hour, mostly about ordinary things: work, the hotel, how Seattle had changed. It was the first conversation in years that felt like two siblings, not adversaries on opposite sides of pride. When we left, he hugged me tight. It was the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. That evening, our parents came to dinner at my apartment. It had been more than a decade since they'd sat at the same table. Mom brought homemade lasagna. Dad brought a bottle of wine. They both looked uncertain at first, as if they'd forgotten how to occupy the same space. Ethan arrived late, carrying a loaf of bread from the bakery we used to visit as kids. The four of us sat down. Conversation started stiffly, safe topics like traffic, weather, the view from my balcony. But then Dad made a joke about Mom's cooking. She rolled her eyes, and suddenly laughter filled the room. No one mentioned the Hayes family, or the wedding, or the scandal. There was no need. The silence that followed between bites wasn't awkward. It was warm, healing. The kind of silence that comes only when people are finally done fighting ghosts. When everyone left, I stood by the window again, watching the city lights reflect off the water. The wind carried the smell of rain, faint and familiar. Somewhere behind me, the table still held the remnants of dinner, the half-empty wine glasses, the sound of my family's voices lingering in the air. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of holding everyone together. The pieces had finally started to find their places on their own. The Hayes empire might have fallen, but in the quiet that followed, something better had been rebuilt in its place. Not wealth, not reputation, just truth. And that, I realized, was more lasting than any legacy money could buy. Chapter 8. Healing and Justice. A year later, the city felt different, calmer. Maybe it was me who had changed. The chaos of the past year had settled into something still and solid, like sand finally finding its level after a storm. The Aurora Grande had grown stronger, not just as a business but as a symbol of integrity. Out of everything that had happened, I wanted something good to take root. That was how the True Values Grant was born. It started as a simple idea funding women who wanted to start their own hospitality ventures. I had seen too many stories like mine, women dismissed, underestimated, silenced by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The grant became a way to turn pain into purpose. We built a partnership with local banks, created mentorship programs, and offered small business funding. Every application I read reminded me of the strength it takes to rebuild after being broken. The launch event took place in the ballroom of Aurora Grande, the same room that once held tension and betrayal. Now it glowed with soft light and quiet pride. My staff moved gracefully through the crowd. Guests mingled, investors smiled, and the scent of fresh flowers replaced the cold memory of conflict. Ava stood beside me, raising a glass. "You did it," she said, "from scandal to philanthropy. That's poetic." I smiled. It wasn't revenge, it was renewal. Ethan arrived later, looking more like himself again. He had found steady work with a construction firm in Seattle, designing sustainable housing projects. With him was a woman I had heard about but never met, Sarah Mitchell, an architect with kind eyes and a gentle confidence. She shook my hand warmly. "Madison, I've heard so much about you. It's a privilege to finally meet the woman who built this place." The way she said it carried no flattery, only respect. Ethan looked at her with something I hadn't seen in him for years. Peace. The evening moved along easily. Guests applauded as we announced the first round of grant recipients. Some of them cried when they spoke about their dreams, and I felt tears sting my own eyes. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't remembering pain. I was witnessing what could grow from it. Then, near the end of the night, I saw her, Charlotte. She stood just inside the doorway, dressed simply in a black dress, her hair tied back. No cameras, no entourage. She was thinner, her posture smaller, her confidence stripped of polish, but replaced with something more human. Conversations around her hushed for a moment, then resumed cautiously. Ethan noticed her too, his jaw tightening slightly, but I raised a hand to stop him from reacting. "Let her come." She approached slowly, heels clicking against the marble. When she reached the table where I stood, she didn't smile. She opened her clutch and placed a white envelope on the linen. Inside was a check for $80,000. I looked at it, then at her. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm not here for forgiveness, Madison. Just respect. That money was never mine." I waited a moment before speaking. "You don't owe me money, Charlotte." "Maybe not," she said, "but I owe you the truth." For the first time, she met my eyes without pretense. There was no defiance, no bitterness, only the kind of tired honesty that comes when someone has finally faced themselves. I nodded once. Dignity can't be bought, but truth can redeem. Something flickered in her expression. Maybe gratitude, maybe relief. She extended her hand. I took it. The shake was brief, polite, final. We weren't friends. We didn't need to be. We were two women who had walked through the same fire from opposite sides. After she left, Ethan came up beside me. "You handled that better than anyone else could have." I looked out across the room, where the first grant recipients were laughing together, holding their certificates with pride. It wasn't about handling it. It was about finishing it. He smiled. Sarah joined him, resting her hand lightly on his arm. Watching them together, I realized the story that began with a broken wedding had found its way back to something whole. Later, after everyone had gone, I walked alone through the ballroom. The lights were dim, the tables cleared. I could still smell the faint trace of flowers and champagne. I stood where Charlotte had placed the check, now folded inside my pocket. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the gesture, the circle closing. Outside, the night was calm, the city lights shimmered on the bay. Ava texted me from her car, one simple line, "You did it." I typed back, "Not alone." I stayed there a while, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of wind against the glass. It felt like the world had finally exhaled. Karma never forgets anyone. It simply waits until you're calm enough to see justice unfold. And if you've ever had to choose between kindness and self-respect, choose self-respect, because that's where justice begins.